Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. I'm going to start in about 2 minutes. We are looking today at Psalm 51, and also we're looking at Isaiah chapter 58, verses 5 through 12. I'm going to get a glass of water, but I wanted to log on so that folks can find the video easily in the queue. I'll be right back. Okay, we're going to start in about a minute. And again, we're looking at Psalm 51 and also Isaiah 58. Okay, I'm going to start. So welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We're looking today at Psalm 51 and also Isaiah 58, verses 5 through 12. Those happen to be the two of the three readings that we looked at last night during our Ash Wednesday service. They happen to be on the lectionary every year on Ash Wednesday. And because they're such great texts, I wanted to keep going with them through Thursday with you. So I'm going to begin with the first of the three P's, which is prayer. And this is a prayer called a welcoming prayer. And it's from this book, Richard Rohr's Just This. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I welcome everything that comes to me today because I know it's for my healing. I welcome all thoughts, feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire for power and control. I let go of my desire for affection, esteem, approval, and pleasure. I let go of my desire for survival and security. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, person, or myself. I open to the love and presence of God and God's action within. Amen. Okay, so during my homily last night, I referred to an article in the Christian Century. It's a little introduction by the editor. His name is Peter Marty, where he talks about the spiritual discipline of opting in. And also part of the spiritual discipline for him is learning more about his privilege, the privilege of being able to opt out of certain situations. So I want to read a couple of excerpts of this from you. Then I'm going to go back to Richard Rohr's Just This and read a couple of snippets about the inner work, as Richard Rohr calls it, of introspection. And this all falls under the second of the three P's, which is perspective. So first, Peter Marty. I have begun a new spiritual discipline in my life. It's an effort to notice how often in a given day I take advantage of personal luxuries that allow me to opt out of certain situations. The more closely I observe other people who lack the resources, connections, or affluence to be able to opt out of undesired circumstances, the clearer my faith bearings become. He goes on. I have noticed thousands of ways that people like and unlike me are able to opt out of unwelcome circumstances without any dire consequences. Attention to these ways is what now gives shape to this recent spiritual discipline. If you own a car, he says, you can opt out of public transportation. If you enjoy a certain level of comfort, security, and means, You can opt out of the local public school system and go private, or move to an upscale community where the public schools are in better shape. If you fly and want to opt out of arriving with pain from insufficient legroom, you can become an airline club member. We're all familiar with the inequities of the justice system, he says, in which minor offenders can opt out of jail by posting bail. As we also know, he says, people who live in relative safety and comfort regularly exercise the privilege of opting out of conversations about racism, or even developing an elemental awareness of the cruel consequences of systemic injustice. So Peter Marty goes on after this to talk about how enamored he is of Christ as Christ is presented in the Gospels, because Jesus in the Gospels doesn't opt out, even though at times the disciples themselves are pressuring him to opt out of walking the way toward the cross. So even though Jesus is at times being pressured to opt out, he never does. He instead opts in. And so this is how Peter Marty concludes. The privilege that so many of us enjoy of being able to opt out of less than desirable circumstances should induce neither pride nor guilt. Our greater responsibility is to identify and choose opportunities to opt in and share in the work of strengthening the common good. When we get to the Isaiah text in just a little bit, we'll see some examples of what opting in looks like according to the prophet. Now, in Richard Rohr's book, Just This, he gives us some techniques for self-examination, examining those places in our lives where we might be opting out. So here's what he writes. The Zen Buddhist masters tell us we need to wipe the mirror of our minds and hearts in order to see what's there without our distortions or even our explanations. Not what we're afraid is there, nor what we wish were there, but what is actually there. That is what a true mirror does, and thus offers perfect freedom. Mirror wiping is the inner discipline of calmly observing our own patterns, what we see and what we don't, in order to get our demanding, over-defended egos away from the full control they always want. It requires us to stand at a distance from ourselves and listen and look with calm, non-judgmental objectivity. A little later in this book, he elaborates on contemplation. Much of the early work of contemplation, this kind of inner work that he's talking about, is discovering a way to observe yourself from a compassionate and non-judgmental distance until you can eventually live more and more of your life from this inner calm awareness and acceptance. You will find yourself smiling, sighing, and weeping at yourself, much more than needing either to hate or to congratulate yourself, because you are finally looking at yourself with the eyes of God. Actually, what is happening is you are letting God gaze at you in the only way God can gaze, with infinite mercy and love. Later on in that book, Richard Rohr talks about this practice of introspection, or learning more about yourself and your motives. He calls it scanning for spiritual malware, to look for those places in our lives that are hanging us up so that we can, as he says, find or discover perfect freedom. Okay, the third P is pieces of scripture. So both of these readings, again, were read yesterday on Ash Wednesday. Psalm 51 is an introspective text, very much consistent with the stuff that we just looked at from Peter Marty and Richard Rohr. And then Isaiah 58 is an example of what opting in looks like, again, referring to what Peter Marty just described. So I'm going to begin by reading the whole of Psalm 51, and then I'll talk a little bit about the text. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence, and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner, when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being. Therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me in a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. Okay, so this psalm begins with a heading. It talks about prayer for cleansing and pardon, and it gives a possible historical scenario, which is this interaction between the prophet Nathan and King David after King David had ravished the woman Bathsheba. Some people say he raped her. And then this psalm, if that's the context, this psalm would be David's just overwhelming guilt at what he had done. However, that's an unlikely scenario. We can't know for sure, but it seems very unlikely based on some of the cues that are in the psalm itself. So one scholar, his name is Robert Alter, this is what he writes about Psalm 51. In all likelihood, this psalm is a general penitential psalm composed centuries after David. If the reference to the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in the penultimate verse is an integral part of the original psalm and not an editorial addition, the text would have to date sometime after 586 BCE, when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. So what he's saying here is that phrase, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, near the end of the psalm, that's a reference to some scenario where Jerusalem has already been destroyed and now needs to be rebuilt. And if that's attached to the whole psalm, in other words, it wasn't added by some later editor, if it's part of the original psalm, then the psalm itself must presume sometime after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, which would place this psalm sometime in the 6th century BCE and not several centuries earlier when King David lived. But by calling Psalm 51 a penitential psalm, Robert Alter here is opening up the possibility that this psalm has a timeless quality to it, even though it's very personal, even though it's in the language of prayer, personal prayer between the poet and God. It still has this timeless quality to it that applies regardless of the historical scenario, regardless of the time period. It's indeed a psalm that anyone could pray at any time. Christians read this psalm every year at Ash Wednesday because it's penitential in nature and it's consistent with the penitential posture that goes along with the season of Lent. And Jews read verse 11, which reads here, "Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me." Jews read verse 11 during the Jewish high and holy days, the days of awe, as part of the penitential posture of the days of awe. Now, in terms of structure, this psalm is split into two parts. So verses 1 through 9 is the first part, and verses 10 through 19 is part 2. Both parts begin and end the same way, which is pretty interesting. So part 1, which again is verses 1 through 9, the first part of part 1, verses 1 through 3, you see here four appeals or four pleas that the poet makes to God. Verse 1, have mercy on me, O God. Also in verse 1, blot out my transgressions, which is erase the memory of my sins. Verse 2, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. And also in verse 2, cleanse me from my sin. So these are pleas or requests crying out to God for mercy and erasing and washing and cleansing. The poet wants to be made whole and new again. And the end part of part 1, starting in verse 7, talks about the temple. So again, both parts begin and end the same way. Both begin with various pleas to God and end with some reference to the temple. So we just saw the pleas in the first couple of verses of part 1. It refers to the temple at the end of part 1, starting in verse 7. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. This is a reference to a temple ritual. So hyssop in temple liturgy, this goes all the way back to the book of Leviticus in the Bible. Hyssop is a part of the cleansing of a person with a skin disease in Leviticus. So this imagery of cleansing that we just saw is consistent with the writer's reference here to hyssop at the end of part 1. So in Leviticus, the priest takes hyssop, which is a small wild shrub whose branches were used to sprinkle liquid, takes this hyssop and sprinkles blood and water on the person to make them ritually clean. So the theme of being made whole, being made clean again, is pervasive in part 1 of this psalm. The writer begins with pleas to God, pleading for cleansing, and ends part 1 with reference to cleansing by referring to hyssop and temple ritual. Part 2, same structure. Begins with requests made of God and ends with a reference to the temple. So in verse 10, the writer says, create in me a clean heart, carrying on this theme of being made clean. Verse 10 also, put a new and right spirit within me. So fix me is the request. Verse 11, the verse that's read during the Jewish high and holy days. Do not cast me away from your presence. Also in verse 11, do not take your spirit from me. That reference to spirit, in Hebrew it's ruach, so it can mean wind or breath. Do not take your breath, your life breath from me. The implication is that the poet is requesting to continue on in his or her or their life, to not have this life breath be removed. They don't want to die. That's the implication of the language. Verse 12, continuing on with these requests made of God at the beginning of part 2 of the psalm, restore me to joy. And then also in verse 12, sustain and uphold me. Then at the end of part 2, we have a reference to the temple. So in verse 18, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild its temple. And also in at the end of part 2, verse 19, take delight again in sacrifices and burnt offerings. So the structure is the same in both parts. It begins with requests and ends with reference to the temple, both in part 1 and in part 2. Now, the temple wasn't standing when King David was alive. Indeed, it was Solomon, his son, who built the temple. So because of this imagery around the temple that's being used here, it's likely that the historical scenario that appears in our Bible at the heading underneath the title Psalm 51 is probably not the actual historical scenario for the writing of Psalm 51. It's probably written sometime centuries later, in part because of this request to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, which presumes that they've been torn down. So again, what this suggests, because it is difficult to pin down the historical scenario of the psalm, what this suggests is that the psalm has a kind of timeless quality to it. It could be any Israelite poet crying out to God for forgiveness and cleansing. It's a poem for anyone who feels burdened or feels shame or feels guilt. Verses 16 and 17 are key to understanding the heart of God that the psalmist is trying to tap into here. So verses 16 and 17, for you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So the idea here is God is not so much concerned with the external trappings of religious practice, the rituals, the doctrines, the dogmas, the belief systems, the sacrifices in this case. What God is looking for is a contrite heart. God is looking at the heart of the person who practices their religion, a humble spirit. It reminds me of the story in the Gospels about the Pharisee and the tax collector. Jesus told the story in Luke's Gospel. So the Pharisee and the tax collector are both in the temple praying to God. The Pharisee is looking with disgust and disdain at this tax collector, saying, oh God, thank you so much that I'm not like that dude right there. I've done all this great stuff. Look how pious I am. Meanwhile, the tax collector stands at a distance and is beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus ends that story saying, that one went away justified instead of the other. So it's an illustration of where God's heart is at. God's heart is concerned with our hearts, more so than how assiduous we are in practicing various religious traditions or believing the right doctrines or abiding by the right dogmas. God is far more interested in what's going on inside of us and how that manifests itself in our lives. It reminds me also of a statement that the writer Anne Lamott once made, where she used baseball imagery to talk about the grace of God, this grace that is concerned with the interior lives of people and accepting people as they are in spite of their shame and their burdens. What she says is grace bats last. Now, of course, the home team in baseball bats last and gets a chance to win the game. Well, she says grace bats last when it comes to how God relates to us. So now back to the perspective that I talked about a little bit ago. Peter Marty talking about really examining his life to see the privilege that he enjoys of being able to opt out of situations that are undesirable. And then Richard Rohr's talk of the inner work of introspection and trying to examine ourselves and our motives. This particular psalm is an example of introspection, where the psalmist, the poet, is examining his or her or their life and longing to be free. Likely, this is a psalmist who has done something they're feeling guilty about and wanting forgiveness. And of course, God answers a plea like that. How could God resist? Because grace bats last. Okay. One of the other things that Peter Marty mentioned was opting in and choosing moments to opt in to try to make a difference in people's lives. And so that theme comes up, or helps us understand, I should say, what we find in Isaiah 58, verses 5 through 12. So verse 5. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. So in terms of historical context, this is the last part of the book of Isaiah, starting in chapter 56 and going to chapter 66. Some people call it third Isaiah. Most likely, Isaiah is split into at least three parts, first, second, and third. Third Isaiah is the written last of the three, and it presumes a context when the people of Israel have returned to their land from being exiled in Babylon. This would be during the Persian period. And now that they're back in the land, there are issues related to how they relate to each other. So this is what the prophet is getting at when he talks here about loosing the bonds of injustice, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, etc., etc. It's caring for those people who are living with you in your society. The focus has shifted from where it was in second Isaiah. In second Isaiah, the people are in exile. And the prophet there is helping to encourage them to remain strong in their faith because their deliverance is soon coming. God is trying to comfort them in the midst of their distress. Third Isaiah presumes a different context than that. They're back in their land, and now it's how do we relate to each other in a way that's consistent with the ancient practices of our faith and with the most prominent exhortation in the Bible to love your neighbor as yourself. So one idea that we glean from Psalm 51 is that God is not as much interested in the external trappings of religious practice as much as God's interested in what's going on in the heart, the posture of the person. This particular passage reinforces this idea, but it goes even a little bit further and talks about what it looks like for an internal heart that longs to do good in the world and to do what God wants, what that actually looks like in society. Again, it's not so much about particular religious practices or particular belief structures or doctrinal structures. It's about how we act towards a neighbor. That is a revelation or a revealing of what's going on inside of us. So verses 6 and 7 make this point clearly. So this is the prophet claiming to speak on behalf of God. And notice throughout this passage that the name of God is capital L-O-R-D. Whenever we see that in an English translation, that's the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh. So this prophet is claiming to speak on behalf of Yahweh. So this is Yahweh speaking here. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, to cover the naked, etc., etc.? So this is the manifestation of a heart that truly wants to do the right thing in the world. It's immediately manifested in how we treat a neighbor. So this is an example of what I mentioned a second ago with respect to Peter Marty in the Christian Century, talking about those moments where we can opt in and make a difference in the world. So for Peter Marty, it's both and. It's like Psalm 51 and Psalm 58. It's both the introspection, Psalm 51, and opting in, Isaiah 58. So introspection is, for Peter Marty, recognizing more and more, becoming more aware of the privilege that many of us enjoy in life, the privilege to opt out of undesirable situations. It's a privilege to be able to socially distance and not have to go into a place of work, to be able to work from home. That's a privilege. It's a privilege to opt out of having to work away from home. So there are lots of privileges like that. And so Peter Marty is exhorting us to think about those moments and then shift from the Psalm 51 introspection to the Isaiah 58 opting in, shift to opting in. And then, as he says, work to make a difference in the world. All of this reminds me of a passage in the letter of James in the New Testament, where James says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Widows and orphans, it's a common trope in the Bible to refer to widows and orphans because someone who is orphaned or someone who is widowed was almost wholly exposed to the vicissitudes of economic distress. Because in the ancient world, it was often the male figure who sustained the family. And if the male figure has died, orphaning the child, or died and widowing the wife, it would leave them bereft of help. And there were no real social programs in antiquity to sustain people at risk. So to refer to widows and orphans in a passage like in James or even in Isaiah 58 is to talk about those people who are most at risk, those people who are most exposed to economic and social hardship. This particular passage in James, and it's consistent with what we're looking at here in Isaiah 58, it's kind of a heart and a hands approach to religious practice. So it's contrition, it's humility, it's honesty, and then it's handwork. It's engaging in the world in meaningful ways. It's both and. It's both Psalm 51 and Isaiah 58. It's both the heart and the hands. It also reminds me of a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 25, where Jesus is speaking. And he says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. So Jesus is addressing here his followers who have done all of these things for other people. But Jesus is personalizing it, saying, yes, you went to go visit that person in prison, but actually you were visiting me. And when you fed that person who was hungry, you were feeding me. He's personalizing it. And what's interesting about Matthew 25 is the people he's addressing there, they don't even realize that the whole time they have been serving Christ by doing what they're doing. They just did it. These are people in need, and they worked to meet the need. There are also no prerequisites in Matthew 25 for offering help, nor are there prerequisites in James's mentioning of orphans, helping orphans and widows. Because pure religious practice, the kind that Isaiah talks about in Isaiah 58, is about helping those in need no matter who they are. So those in Matthew 25 who visited prisoners in prison, they didn't first ask what kinds of crimes those prisoners committed before they decided to go visit them. There are no prerequisites here to showing mercy and compassion to somebody. Likewise, those who fed the hungry didn't ask first if the reason why they were hungry is because they spent all their money on drugs instead of on food. There are no prerequisites. The person is hungry, and so these folks reached out to meet the need. Likewise, those who cared for the sick didn't first ask if those sick had done something to deserve their illness. No prerequisites. The assumption is a person who's in need deserves, just by virtue of being in need, deserves to be treated with compassion. And then finally, those who welcomed the stranger into their houses or into their churches didn't first ask if those strangers were documented or undocumented. There are no prerequisites. If somebody needs a place to stay, you offer it if you can. So in every case, those who offered help just did it. No questions asked, no prerequisites. The people who offered help didn't even know that they were doing so in the sense of meeting the needs of Christ himself. They just did it, spur of the moment, offering help. What this all points to is this kind of offering help to somebody in need as best as we can is what grace looks like in the real world. Because grace is wholly undeserved. It is favor given to somebody regardless of whether they deserve it or not. And most likely, despite the fact they don't deserve it, you still offer it. Grace is freely offered. So this kind of compassion that we're seeing in all of these passages, whether it's Matthew 25, James 1, or Isaiah 58, this sort of compassion is a manifestation of grace. It's meeting somebody's need without any prerequisites or requirements in advance. So this is why I wanted to begin by quoting from the Peter Marty article about the privilege of opting out. The privilege to not be hungry or thirsty or a stranger or in prison or cold without clothes is something to ponder. The privilege for many of us living outside of Texas right now, which so many millions of people are in pain and hurting in Texas because of the power outages. It's a privilege for many of us in the Northeast to live in a place where we have sort of better mechanisms for dealing with winter storm events because we get hammered every single year with winter weather. It's a privilege in some ways to live in this kind of a context. So we feel compassion, feel empathy for those who don't enjoy such privileges. But Isaiah and James and Matthew invite us not just to ponder when we can opt out, but they invite us to self-reflect and then to decide with Peter Marty to opt in and try to make a difference in the world for those who are in need without any prerequisites. Because opting in to help somebody is what grace looks like in practice. God who shows us grace, we then go and show grace to others, offering it freely to all. Okay, I will see you next week.